Exorcisms have fascinated humanity for centuries, blending elements of faith, fear and the unknown. Hollywood, ever the storyteller, well, they've capitalised on this fascination by turning exorcisms into blockbuster spectacles. Films such as The Conjuring and The Exorcism of Emily Rose, and let's not forget The Exorcist in 1973. Well, they've etched the concept of demon possession and its dramatic expulsion into our culture. But just how do these cinematic portrayals compare to real-life exorcisms? Well, today we're going to delve into a true story that took place here in the northwest of England and here in the parish of Whalley. And that story involves a 19-year-old man by the name of Richard Dugdale. So what is the difference between Hollywood and real-life exorcisms? Well, for the answer, all you have to do is choose one movie of your choice when it comes to the religious aspect and anything to do with possessions. And then you'll get your answer. Basically, Hollywood are always going to embellish what they're trying to portray. And nearly every horror film that has a religious element to it, they'll have a little blurb. Most of them will have a blurb simply saying, based on a true story. Now, we do have to take that blurb with a pinch of salt, because this true story that they're trying to portray will be extremely loosely based on a true story, if that makes sense. So, Hollywood, they're going to throw in a lot of embellishments. They're going to throw in over-the-top blood and gore, dramatic music, dramatic narratives. So exorcisms today, I think a lot of people go into the complexities of that individual. We know a lot about dementia, psychological details such as schizophrenia, paranoia. We also have subtle differences in how long an exorcism actually takes place in real life, not like in Hollywood movies. So in the movies, we normally see it taking place over the course of a day, maybe a week. But real life exorcisms have been known to take place over days, months, if not years. And in the tale, the context of Richard Dugdale, the events that transpired took place over a matter of months. And for days and weeks, Richard, he would be pinioned. He would be fastened to a bed in an old, dirty-looking barn somewhere around here in Altham. He would have holy water flung onto him. He would have rites from the Bible read out to him, and all the time he will be violent. He will be trying to break away from the chains that are holding him to the bed. Grown men would have to hold him down. Such were his violent outbursts. But the difference between Hollywood and real life is like chalk and cheese. And we do have to remember, Hollywood, it's an entertainment. They make films to entertain people, so they have to compact everything in as quickly and as dramatically as possible, unlike real life exorcisms.
Today is the festival of the rush bearing, when the children collect rushes, heather and flowers and make them into crosses in memory of St. Oswald. The festival is a relic of the very early days when rushes were used to carpet the unpaved floors of churches. The young rush bearers form up in procession and march through the town to the church.
So it was on or around the 25th of July 1688 when that rush bearing event took place, or that rush bearing festival I should say took place. And it is here at St Mary's Church in Whalley when Richard Dugdale, he came here to enjoy the festivities. He'd had a lot to drink, but from all accounts he wasn't a very good dancer. And from what we've read, he was trying to impress a young lady here. Now, after plenty of drink, it was rumoured, or it's been written, that Richard, whether or not he said it in jest, he was joking, but he said he would basically sell his soul to the devil if he could dance. It was words to that effect. Now, Richard left St Mary's, or the old Whalley Church as it was known then, to make his way back home, and we're going to go towards where he used to live shortly. But he left here with his father, Thomas. And from all accounts, again, we're going off old historic text, we're going off the old pamphlet that Thomas Jolly wrote. But from all accounts, Thomas and his son Richard, they encountered a little bit of bother just outside of the church itself. Now, obviously, they were full of drink, they were drunk, and this little scuffle that took place, it was something or nothing, because once Richard made his way back home, he didn't really have any marks on his body as such. There was no fighting that took place. But he did complain of one thing, and that was a burning sensation to his side, like he had been stung by 1,000 nettles, or he had been stabbed by something sharp. And this will become the very first start, or the early beginnings, of Richard Dugdale's possession. Now, directly in front of us is Abbey House, and it is here in the grounds, or on the grounds, of Whalley Abbey, where Richard Dugdale was once employed. And he was employed as a gardener for Sir Edmund Ashton. And as you can see, it's a grand structure, and it has been here for many, many hundreds of years. Now, as for Richard Dugdale's home, we're a little unsure, and I don't think anybody can pinpoint exactly where his home was situated. We know he lived in a barn of sorts within or close to the grounds of Whalley Abbey. But like I said, there is no definitive proof as to where that barn used to be located. But these are the grounds of Whalley Abbey. And we do have an old map from the 1700s. It's an artist rendition which clearly shows the structures here where we stood right now in this location of the Abbey, as well as the Ashton's former home. But interestingly, it does show a barn of sorts to the right-hand side of this magnificent structure. Now, whether or not that may well have been the home, the former home of Richard Dugdale, we can only hazard a guess to. But I'll put that sketch, that drawing over now, and you can make up your own minds. If, obviously, you want to believe that that may well have been the home of Richard. It seems that when Richard had returned home and he was suffering from some form of stabbing sensation in his side. Later on that evening, he began to experience fits and seizures, and these would become extremely violent in time. And over the matter of hours, and then into the days, and then the weeks, these violent outbursts, these fits, these seizures got worse and worse. Now, he would later go on to say, and we'll get into this shortly, but Richard would later go on to say to a man called Thomas Jolly that he began hearing voices, and he also began to see things. Now, these voices apparently came from under a kitchen table, under an old table.
And take thy fill of
There was nobody
pleasures.
there.
Take and enjoy what honours thou desirest. Take, and thou shalt have all the riches thou wilt.
And then these hallucinations, these things he was seeing, they began to appear on top of the table. So there was food on one instance, and then there were gifts such as gold, silver. There was an all manner of different things appearing in front of him. They were hallucinations. But it's these voices that seemed to be telling him to take what he wanted, to do what he wanted, that would become the more concerning. Now, Richard will go on to tell this Thomas Jolly that he didn't fall for it, he didn't take anything, and he didn't wish for anything. But we're going to get into that shortly when we visit another location, and one that plays an important role in the exorcism of Richard Dugdale. Now, obviously, with everything that was going on, Richard's family were becoming a little concerned. And they decided to send for two doctors, one being the name Dr. Crabtree and the other being Dr. Crewe. But it appears that these doctors couldn't do anything at all for young Richard. And we don't know quite how it transpired, but we know that the family then turned their attention to a pastor over in Altham. And this pastor's name was Thomas Jolly. Now, this all occurred on or around the 29th of April, 1689. So quite a few months after the Rushbearing Festival in 1688. It's almost a year when that Rushbearing Festival took place, and from when Richard began experiencing these strange symptoms. Now, Thomas Jolly used to live in a place known, and still is to this day, called Wymond Houses over in Pendleton, and this is pretty much under the shadow of Pendle Hill. And Jolly himself had been a former pastor at the Church of Altham. Now, we're not going to get into too much of the history of Thomas Jolly, simply because it's a story in itself. It has been written in some articles that the barn, the home of Richard Dugdale, may have been on that side here next to Whalley Abbey. We're not sure. Again, like I said, nobody can prove or give a definitive idea as to where Richard Dugdale's house used to be. But like I said, that sketch that we've shown you shows the house being just over there in that direction. Now, as for Thomas Jolly, and going back to his involvement in this case, upon seeing Richard and his family over at Wymond Houses in Pendleton, Jolly was pretty much convinced that Richard had been possessed by the devil, by Satan himself. And he would arrange for a number of people to come and help dispel this satanic presence from the body of Richard Dugdale. And himself, Richard and his family, along with quite a few other former ministers, priests, people of religion, they would make their way to a place called Spar Manor. And that is situated just a couple of miles, a few miles further back in Claytonley Moors. Now, it was at Spar Manor where Richard himself would be examined by all these people. His parents would also be spoken to. They would be examined. Now, when I use the word examined, I think Richard himself, his body may have been looked over for any markings of the devil itself. So any moles, any disformities, disfigurements, something which back in the 1600s would indicate the presence of a possession or of a demon. As for his parents, I presume the word examined would probably mean they were interviewed, they were spoken to about their son Richard and about how he was acting and what led up to him acting in such a way. But sure enough, Thomas Jolly and all these other religious people, they would offer their services. Now, this is where things get really intriguing, because it appears that when Thomas Jolly began to recite verses from the Bible, Richard turned into, well, the fits, the seizures, they started again. And it seemed that Richard, he just couldn't hear, he couldn't listen to what Thomas Jolly was reading. It seems these religious recitements were infuriating him. And he began to swear, he began to scream a lot, and he had to be held down. And this again would feed into the narrative that he had indeed become possessed. We're now going to make our way over to Altham and to the church where Thomas Jolly was once the pastor. We also know that the exorcism of Richard Dugdale took place somewhere close to where that church is to this day, and not too far away either from Pendleton. However, we can't visit where it took place simply because that barn where all this unravelled is no longer there. It would have gone many, many, many years ago. So there's just no way of knowing exactly where this exorcism took place. But once we get to the church over in Altham, we'll dig a little bit deeper into this amazing story. For examples of real life exorcisms, we can look back to the 1970s and to that of Anneliese Michel. And her exorcism took place in Germany. Now, the exorcism of Anneliese Michel is quite disturbing. And it is a story, again, possibly for another day. But if you look online and search her name up, you will find original videotapes, photographs, but more disturbingly, audio tapes of that exorcism. And you will hear Anneliese's voice change dramatically over the course of her exorcism. And this is something similar to what happened and what transpired with the exorcism of Richard Dugdale. He was known for speaking in different languages, Greek and Italian being two. And if you want another example of a real life exorcism taking place, and it was the basis for the movie The Exorcist, which came out in 1973, you need no look further than that of Roland Dawe. And again, it's a story that is quite big and too big for today's video. But check out Anneliese Michel and Roland Dawe online and research it for yourselves, because they are two fascinating true cases, true stories of actual exorcisms taking place. And like I said, the Roland Dawe story was the inspiration for the movie The Exorcist. After the meeting at Wymond Houses with Thomas Jolly, and Jolly believing that Richard's fits were being caused by a possession, and as we touched upon, Jolly tried reciting many prayers from the Bible itself, but he was unsuccessful in casting out the demon which was possessing Richard. But undeterred, it was around, and I'm sure it was the 8th of May, 1689, when more of Thomas Jolly's acquaintances, they all gathered at a place known as Spar Manor. Now, after hearing Richard's story, these ministers began again reciting prayers. And this put Richard into another bout or another frenzy of fits and seizures. Now, the ministers, they would have regular meetings. But before they tried to help Richard, they would fast. And this was to cleanse their souls, their bodies, from any unwanted intrusions. They would again begin reading the Bible, hoping to rid the demon that was possessing Richard. But again, they failed. Now, it was during the reciting of the Bible and trying to expel this demon that had possessed Richard, Richard began making some really bizarre noises. And some say they sounded like swine, bears and other strange animals. Well, I wouldn't say strange animals, but other animals. But certainly noises that a man should not be making. He would also begin shouting profanities at those trying to help him. So during his outbursts, his violent outbursts, he would be swearing quite heavily. And this would, again, as I said further back in Whalley, it would perhaps appeal to the narrative that something indeed was possessing Richard. Now, Richard's violent outbursts, they would become so violent that he would becoming a threat not just to his own well-being, but also those who were trying to help him. So they had no choice but to pin him down to a bed. Now, a young gentleman, and he was a practicing minister, he would be called for, and his name was John Carrington. But this is where Richard's exorcism takes a sinister turn. You see, Richard didn't know John Carrington. He'd never heard of John Carrington. But before Carrington's arrival, and before his name was even mentioned, Richard came out with something on the lines of, Carrington will shortly be here, and Carrington will rot in hell, and other profanities all relating to this Carrington character. And this shocked the ministers, Thomas Jolly, as well as his colleagues, because how did Richard Dugdale know of Carrington? Now, in total, there were 5 ministers who were trying to help Richard Dugdale. And along with Thomas Jolly, there was Robert Waddington, Thomas Whalley, Charles Sagar and Nicholas Kershaw. And there was also a local vicar by the name of Stephen Gay, who was informed of what was to be done. Now, the Church of England, they strongly, at the time, they would disapprove of any form of exorcism, because simply they believed that it would just cause unrest within not just the local community, but also the Catholic religion as a whole. And we also have to bear in mind that the time when this exorcism was taking place, witchcraft in England was quite rife. And those involved with any form of exorcism were putting their own well-being at risk. Because would you want to be involved with an exorcism when witchcraft was quite high, and a possibility that you yourself may be accused of performing arts in witchcraft? Now, the story goes on to say that the exorcism of Richard Dugdale took place in a barn somewhere in that direction. But we will never know exactly where that barn used to be located, because obviously the landscape has changed so much. We're in the year 2025, and this story took place back in 1689. So many, many years, obviously, have gone by. But it was written in the booklets written by Thomas Jolly in 1692 that many people would make their way across these fields and across that river directly in front and towards where Richard Dugdale and the exorcism was taking place. And it was also said that in one incident, there were that many people in the barn that one of the posts holding the rafters of the barn together was actually damaged, but luckily the roof stayed up and nobody was injured. But that took place somewhere over there in the distance. Now, John Carrington would soon arrive here in Altham, and he would begin performing the rites and the exorcism on Richard Dugdale, and Carrington himself would become one of the main players in this entire story. And this story would later become known as the Surey Demoniack. Now, in one incident when Carrington was reciting the Lord's Prayers, Richard again became agitated, violent, and whilst pinioned and tied to the bed itself in this barn, he came out with many expletives, many threats to Carrington himself. It was on or around the 25th of July 1689 when events would escalate, and Dugdale himself was transported or moved to a barn here in Altham. The following week, Richard himself would become more threatening. His demeanour would change and people were becoming more and more afraid. But Richard also began to speak in what people at the time thought was in Latin and Greek. But he would also call out the rich, the wealthy, and the sins of these kind of people by saying things such as, "That as maids do sweep away spiders' webs, so would their wealth be swept away." And this agitated and annoyed, well, the wealthier side of people, the wealthier people who were all eager and curious as to what was actually occurring here over in Altham. It was during one occasion and one exorcism that John Carrington arrived late at the barn, and Richard began swearing and screaming at him, and on one instance he shouted,
"What brings thee here at this time of day? Thou comest too late, I defy thee. Thou art but of a weak faith. Thou canst not prevail against me. Thy faith is but hypocritical."
Now it appears that the exorcism of Richard Dugdale, it would carry on for weeks, leading up to the late autumn of 1689. And it was again on or around the early start of September, around the 3rd of September that year, when the demon came forward saying that it would carry him off to hell within 50 days' time. Now, towards the end of that month, Richard was asked by many of the ministers and that of John Carrington, how was the demon allowed into his body? And they asked him if he had any illnesses that he was aware of, to which Richard obviously said no. Obviously the story of the rush bearing would be mentioned by Thomas Jolly, but they still never got any definitive answer as to how this demon had entered Richard Dugdale's body in the first place. In October of 1689, The booklet, which was written by Thomas Jolly, claims that Carrington was left alone with Dugdale in this barn, and Dugdale began acting in another bizarre way. This time, not a fit, not a seizure, but he began dancing around like a frog, crouching down, jumping up, springing upwards. And at the time, this may have amused John Carrington. We don't know. But things would again take a sinister turn when it was written that Richard vomited up a piece of paper. And on this piece of paper, which was all wet and mangled and chewed up, from all accounts there was written text on it. But this text was hard to decipher because some of the paper was missing, some of the paper had little holes poked into it, and it made reading of this letter, this paper, extremely difficult. Now, interestingly, and just like in the Hollywood movies, the pamphlet or the booklet that Thomas Jolly wrote also detailed an incident in which a mouse was seen running through the barn, and curious spectators who had seen this mouse all shouted, "The demon, the devil." Now, obviously, just like in all the movies that we've seen when it comes to exorcisms, the devil can change form in any way he deems fit. So if he wanted to be a mouse, he can be a mouse. If he wants to be a cat, he can be a cat. And this spooked those who were in the barn in the 1600s to the extent they felt that this mouse was in fact the devil trying to escape. I can understand where they were coming from because, like I said, this is in a time, this is in a period when people were highly religious. They were highly scared as well of things such as witchcraft and the likes. So to see this mouse in this barn running through and running past where Dugdale was lying on a bed, it kind of spooked them because obviously tensions were already high at this point. There is an incident in this tale which again shocked Carrington to the very core. And this incident took place when Carrington went to a basin to wash his face. Now we have to remember that Carrington, whilst he was performing these exorcisms, was fasting. He wasn't eating or drinking, and this was part of the ritual of the exorcism. But Dugdale would accuse Carrington of drinking before their daily meetings because he had seen Carrington washing his face in this basin of water. Now obviously John Carrington, he would deny ever drinking anything, but he was so shocked by this accusation that it set him back. And again, Carrington did not want to continue with the exorcism. But Jolly once again convinced him to come back and carry on. And this time, Carrington demanded to know the name of the demon or the person, the entity that had sent the devil to possess Dugdale. And Dugdale came out with an interesting name called Melampus, Melampus. Now I've looked up online and I've reached out to Peter Laws. And Peter Laws, for many who don't know, he is a religious man and he does a lot on YouTube, a lot of videos, and he also still works as a minister. He's an author, a singer, composer, and a podcaster. But I've asked Peter if he has ever known of the name Melampus. And he hasn't. There is no known demon deity known as Melampus. We do know it's some form of Greek. I don't know if it's a Greek god or a Greek deity, but it's certainly not involved with the wrongdoings of Satan or any other demon that we know of. Now, one name that did come out was that of, is it Beelzebub or Beelzebub? And again, looking up that name, it does appear that that indeed is the name of one of the demons in hell, also known as the Lord of the Flies. And indeed, when Richard Dugdale mentioned this name, some of the witnesses who were there at the time, they would say that they saw a lot of flies flying in and out of Dugdale's nose and mouth. Now, when it comes to this next part of Richard Dugdale's story, I find it difficult to to envisage and to believe, but I can only relay what is in this pamphlet written by Thomas Jolly. And it appears that Richard began to vomit up other things, not just pieces of paper, but he was also vomiting up jewellery, rings. It was also vomiting up coins, gold and silver. Now, take it with a pinch of salt, and obviously we have to remember, like I said, this booklet, this pamphlet was written maybe a year or two after the events of 1689. So we don't know how many embellishments have been added into this booklet, this pamphlet. Perhaps Thomas Jolly, I'm not saying he could cash in on Richard Dugdale's his case, but we don't know how many untruths are written in this book itself. Perhaps he has embellished a lot of what actually occurred in 1689. We'll never know, but I find it hard to believe that somebody could vomit up rings and other jewellery, as well as coins, gold, silver, and the likes. It does become a little bit fanciful and a little bit dramatic, and again, just like what we see in the movies, the Hollywood movies. Now, we have to now talk about Richard Dugdale as a person, because it appears that he was a young man. He was 19 years old, as we already mentioned, but he was also one who liked to play a lot of tricks on people. It was a bit of a tearaway, in that he would play pranks on people a lot of the time, from what we've read. And some people seem to think that a lot of this, and all of this, may well have been a massive prank on Richard Dugdale's part. And the jewellery, the coins that he were vomiting, they were given to him by people who were also in on this prank with him. And the barn itself, in which Dugdale was incarcerated in, it was risen off the floor by several inches. And it was quite conceivable that people were passing things underneath the struts of the barn to where he could grab them. He may be able to put them in his mouth, where he would then vomit them out to make it look like the devil was expelling these things from his body. We will never know, obviously, but some people seem to believe in that line of inquiry, and it is plausible. Like I said, he was a known prankster, so perhaps there is an element of truth in that Richard Dugdale, for the best part, was playing one huge prank on all of the ministers. Things will finally come to an end round about the 24th of March 1689, and it was after one final fit or seizure that Dugdale had encountered. And Dugdale came out and said that it was time for the demon to move on. This was the last time, from what we believe, that Dugdale would suffer from any more violent seizures or fits. The ministers had done their work, or so they believed. They believed that it was their intervention, their work over the weeks and months of trying to exorcise the devil, the demon that was in Dugdale's body. It was their work that had managed to accomplish this. We will leave it with you, the viewer watching this, if you believed or believe that Richard Dugdale was indeed possessed by a demon. Or was it something more natural? Was he suffering from some kind of hallucination? Was he suffering from some form of psychological condition? I'm not saying dementia. I mean, I know dementia can hit anybody at any age, but his violent outbursts, his swearing. I had a relative, a family member, who suffered from dementia many years ago, and she passed away. It was my grandma. And from all accounts, she used to swear a lot during her final days, and she was quite violent. So perhaps there was a form of dementia with Richard Dugdale even at such a young age. Again, we will never know these things. We know now in 2025, medical advancements, we've got psychiatrists, we've got doctors, we've got all manner of specialists that would speak to Richard Dugdale in a completely different context. But back in 1688 and 1689, they never had these kind of facilities and this form of help. So we'll never know what actually occurred with Richard Dugdale back in 1688 and 1689. There are people out there who will believe that Dugdale himself was possessed by a demon. All the mannerisms were there, the way he was acting, the languages he was speaking. Be interesting to know your thoughts down below. Now here at the churchyard in Altham, the former pastor Thomas Jolly is interred. However, it is an unmarked grave. From all accounts, when he was, or before his death I should say, and when he was of ill health, he always maintained he didn't want a headstone in his name. So he is buried somewhere here in the grounds, in the churchyard here in Altham. It's a pity we can't find his headstone because he is one of the main players in the exorcism of Richard Dugdale. But as for the main player in all of this, and that of Jolly Carrington, the trainee minister who worked so hard for days and months trying to expel this devil, this demon from the body of Richard Dugdale, well, from what we believe, he passed away in 1701 and his body is interred just on the outskirts or the boundary of Lancaster Castle. The story itself is a remarkable one, and it is one which I never thought we would find here in the northwest of England. Stories of exorcisms, they're few and far between here in the United Kingdom, and you'll be extremely hard pushed to find any more in the north of England and the northwest of England. So to find one on my own doorstep, close to where I live, we're here in the parish of Whalley itself, I was absolutely blown away by it. And there's a lot more about this case I could easily delve into, but this video would be 2, 3, 4 hours long in nature. It's one I perhaps could have done over 2 parts. But if you're interested in knowing more about it, please look online for that of Richard Dugdale, Whalley, 1688. And you will find booklets on websites which have already retold this story. But as far as I'm aware, it hasn't been covered as a video format, such as what we've done today. But it is interesting, and what occurred back in 1688 into 1689, none of us will ever fully understand. We will never get to the ultimate truth, I guess. Like I said, history, time hasn't been too good with records as such. Now, the only record we do have, and I've touched upon it through the video, is that of the booklet, the pamphlet as it is worded as, written by Thomas Jolly. It's a 72-page booklet. It's handwritten. You can find it online. You can download the PDF, the PDF file of the scanned pages itself. Please do that. I will leave a link in the description of this video, but download it and try to read it yourself. It is written in the old language, the old English language, so it does take a little bit of reading, but there's far more in that document than what I've touched upon in today's video. But please click the link, download it and research it for yourself. It's a fascinating story, and it's one I'm sure you guys may scoff at, and you may say a lot of it was all embellished, and I do agree with that. I find it quite extraordinary, the details in this booklet that Thomas Jolly wrote. And it is written by him, Thomas Jolly, the man who first encountered Richard Dugdale and the man who managed to find help in the form of Jolly Carrington. But how much of it has been embellished? I'll leave that for you to decide. But if you're interested in videos such as this, the dark, the bizarre, true crime, Victorian true crime, things such as that, please consider subscribing to the Days of Horror YouTube channel. We bring out a video each and every Monday afternoon or Monday evening at 7:05 UK time. But if you could also please share this video and other videos, we will greatly appreciate it. We never take your support for granted, and we really do appreciate everything you guys do for us. So if you can please subscribe and share the video, we would really greatly appreciate it. But I'm going to leave it here. It's a very cold morning here in Altham, extremely cold, to the point Vicky's actually got back in the car. She's got the engine running. So we'll leave it here. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you've heard the tale of Richard Dugdale and the Surey Demoniack, please contact us or let us know down below. It's a bizarre one, isn't it? It really is. Do you believe in exorcisms? Do you believe in a human soul can be taken over by a demon? It's a real mind bender, it really is. And if you believe in it, you believe in it. If you don't, you don't. But comment down below if you've heard of Richard Dugdale, or also known as the Surey Demoniack. Be great to know what you think of this one, it really would. But take care guys, look after yourselves, and we'll be back soon with more tales from a dark but at times glorious past.